Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today's January 20th, a very important day in the U.S. Constitution and the calendar year. This is the InfoMullet Facebook Live Ask Me Anything. I am your Chief Mulleteer, Timothy Clancy, and this is Bonky the Emotional Support Donkey. Today's episode is actually on the third Wednesday of every month. We focus on the InfoMullet on international affairs and COVID-19 updates. So for us, it's any given third Wednesday of the month. However, I do recognize that there are some other events of domestic interest in the U.S. going on this particular third Wednesday, January 20th, with the inauguration. If, for those who have been watching it, seems pretty calm, seems pretty normal. So I'm going to stick with my planned coverage, but if anything jumps out, I'll be happy to break in and cover it like I did on January 6th. But again, today we're going to focus on COVID-19, what's going on in the U.S., what's happening globally with the wave 2, look at some of the pandemic responses that different countries have tried and compare, contrast, discuss the strategic risk of the variants to COVID that are coming and how those are going to affect vaccination and other things. We're also going to do a little bit of foreign affairs with what's happening with the protests in Tunisia and might circle into Sudan if we have time at the end. And again, this is a Ask Me Anything. So if you have a question, pop it up in the comments, either related to something I have talked about or something you just want to ask. I'll see if I can fit it in. Again, if it's a topic related more to what happened in Capitol Hill with the insurrection or the impeachment or anything like that, I'll probably get to it on the first Wednesday of the month in February, but go ahead, feel free to ask so I can capture that. So with that said, let's jump into our COVID coverage. So people who have watched this before, let's get started here. So there we go. So when we talk about our COVID-19 coverage here in the US, we're definitely still in wave 2. And the first thing I always like to show is sort of our testing profile. I go from testing to hospitalization rate to deaths to things like that. And this chart comes from calculatedriskblog.com. They do a daily update. It's very good. And again, to clear the chart so everyone watching can understand, the way you read this chart is on the left side is the number of tests per day. And these are these blue columns that are very spiky. It's the tests per day that are being run. Across the bottom is the time. So this covers from March of 2020, March 1st, all the way through today. And on the red, on the right side, is the percentage of percent positive. Now, this is where I start whenever talking about COVID outbreaks, because this percent positive is a very useful number to understand the extent of the pandemic, of what we're seeing and not seeing. You can kind of think of this like being in a submarine. And the problem with the pandemic is we're inside the submarine and the pandemic is out there in the water. We can't see where that pandemic is except if we catch it in a test. And this percent positive, the lower number you have of the percent positive, that means you're testing enough people that very few of them are actually positive. It means you're finding the boundaries of the spread. The higher the percent positive, think of it like you're everyone coming in, there's so many that are positive, you're not sure you're catching all the people who are positive in the community, because remember, there's asymptomatic. So if you have good random testing, good surveillance, that percent positive should be low. And the sort of the best practice we've seen from other countries is about a 3% positive is about where you want to be, 2 to 3%. Well, you can see we haven't been hardly below 5% since wave 1.5 and the beginning of wave 2. And what you can really see here is that we spiked up going into November, and I mentioned this before, the Thanksgiving, right before Thanksgiving. This is where we would have crested wave 2 were it not for Thanksgiving break. And you can see in this percent positive the impact of the travel, and I'll show this on a couple more graphs. I won't belabor this too much, but you can see the impact of the Thanksgiving week travel as we crested the wave. And these wave patterns, by the way, clear wave up and down, wave 1.5 up and down, second wave here. We crest and decline, then it spikes up, it begins to crest again, then it drops right as we head into Christmas holidays. So here's the Christmas travel, and we're finally seeing a decline in this wave 2 in the percent positive. But keep in mind, 10% positive, percent positive is not a good number. I don't want to confuse people that this is like good news story. This is at least showing that we're beginning to crest. And this chart shows where we're at the 7-day moving average of cases and hospitalization. So as we go from positive tests, not everyone who's positive is going to need hospitalization. We now take a step further into the mortality wave. And again, to clear the chart, These are the absolute numbers now of people who have tested positive and who are being hospitalized. And you can see this wave pattern. You know, when we talk about a wave is an increase to peak and then a drop to trough. That's one wave. And when you're talking about pandemics, these waves are categorized by that peak and trough formation. And you can see here the peak was reached, this is the April peak, and it goes down to a trough. Now, it doesn't go back down to zero. That's why I called this summer wave 1.5, because we failed to continue implementing the pandemic measures that we needed to. We allowed it to rekindle, and it sort of picked back up. But then look at this wave 2. This wave 2 is much larger than wave 1 or wave 1.5. And this is this pattern I've described before of an exploding oscillation. And an exploding oscillation is a specific pattern when you have these waves, but the peak of the second wave is higher than the peak of the first wave. The trough of the second wave is higher than the trough of the second wave, and sometimes the trough is higher than the peak. Now, this is a system dynamics method, these exploding oscillations, to look at these patterns, but you can see it here. Here's the peak in red, and you can see peak is the wave point 1. It's about the same. Trough is about the same. So we never get down to zero, but look at this peak, how much higher this wave 2 is, this exploding oscillation. That tells me that even as we approach our trough, let's say that we don't have fortunately, there's no more Thanksgiving or Christmas vacation scheduled where everyone goes on the road and gets each other infected. So hopefully we'll be able to crest this wave 2. But when you see an exploding oscillation like this, the trough is higher than the previous peak. We may have a trough in COVID that is higher than where we were at before in the summer, which is about where we're at when we started. And that is why the forecast is still very negative for what's going on in 2021 in the immediate future. And we'll get a bit more into the vaccines and things like that in the long run. So from hospitalizations lead to deaths. So you get COVID, you show up in a positive test, you could be asymptomatic, you could be mild, you could be like I got it. I had a moderate case. I was in the hospital for 5 days. But if you have a severe or critical case, you may end up in a very dangerous situation. And so we progress along this mortality curve, and we have this death. Now, this chart I've been tracking since March, the daily death rates. And the daily deaths here are across the left is the y-axis is the absolute numbers of deaths. Again, those blue columns is every single day. That's 1 point of data. And then this red line is a 7-day moving average. Now you can see in this data, there's a choppy behavior where just in the US by practice, we have low reporting over the weekend. So Saturday, Sunday, Monday, we tend to have lower reports. That's because of the way that hospitals process their data. That's the way how testing labs work. People have the weekend off, stuff like that. So you see this up and down pattern, but the 7-day moving average smooths that out a little bit. And you can see with the death counts, this wave 1 here crested at a high daily death total and then dropped. And wave 2, 1.5, had a lower death point. And so in the summer, a lot of people had a false sense of security, but we were warning that in the fall, this is going to be a much worse wave 2. And we've seen that manifest in this wave 2. And again, you see these two blips here. Here's one around the end of November, and here's a bigger one. These were the declines that were starting that could have been the end for wave 2. So imagine this line here drops down low because people don't go out on Thanksgiving. This is the impact of travel and letting your guard down when you get into these sort of pandemic situations, is you can actually create a much worse circumstance. And in this, the problem here is the pandemic doesn't really care if we're tired, fatigued. It's not really something you can negotiate with, make an appeal to. It's going to pandemic as it pandemics. And right now, as of yesterday, so this is the data from the 19th. This is yesterday. We're at 401,000 deaths. And that's a gigantic number. It's a number it's hard to fathom because this is not even a full year. If you think about it, this really kicked off here in late March, where we started getting the highs here. This is the 30th of March. So this is really the month of April. We won't be a full year on this chart until we get to pretty much March 30th again. So we still have 2 or 3 months left of what I would call the first full year at full run of COVID-19. And for those who have been following, I track this death against some estimates we made back in March, early March. When I was tracking this, we made some forecasts, and we used the InfoMullet forecast, and we used some from the University of Washington, the IMHE model, and we put both of them in. Now, the point of forecast, it's not a prediction that you change every time new data comes in. With a forecast, you're making a forecast at a point in time. You make a spread of forecasts, you describe the different contingencies under which those arise, and then you see how it results so that you can compare how you're doing against your forecast. Now, you can see these forecasts here, and there's a bunch of lines here. The brown ones are the low, medium, and high for the University of Washington estimate. And the blue is the low, and there were 5 contingencies. It's on the Info Mullet post. There were 5 contingencies of which, and you can see they clustered here with what I thought would be at this 140,000 line. That's the highest I thought it would be. I thought in wave 1 we'd get hit, we'd do bad because we were unprepared, and then as a country, we'd come together and tackle this like we do most problems that hit the US. We'd gather together, we'd put our nose to the grindstone, we'd be pragmatic about it. I was not prepared for how badly we handled this pandemic as a country and as a nation. Now, I had in the March estimates, I had created some multiple forecasts that at the time I thought were absurdly high. I took a lot of thought to make these forecasts, and then I said, hey, what if I'm off by 10? What if I'm off by a factor of 10? This dashed line here is me being off by a factor of 10, and this high dash dot line is me being off by a factor of 30. So I thought, just as a swag, how bad could it be? Let's say I'm 30 times off in my estimate. Well, here we are, we're not even to a year, and we're about to hit that 30 point. It's at 405,000 is what that level is. And I added a red line here to show by comparison. So what does this number mean, right? We're saying 405,000, 150,000. It's hard for people to imagine. This red line is the entire casualty count of World War II for the United States of America over 3.5 years. So that, I mean, to put that in perspective, we will lose more people from COVID-19 probably by the end of this week or next week or sometime very close in less than a year than we did all of World War II. And that's the challenge, I think, of getting your head around what a novel virus pandemic is and how bad it can be if you don't get your act together. And so we're about to cross that threshold next week. So let me pause here and check to see if there's any questions on this part before we go into some of the capacity. Good to see you, Mike, Valeria. Barbara, good to see you. Oh, sorry to hear about that friend tested positive. Ooh, passed this morning. My condolences. Yeah, no underlying conditions. And oh, Jason mentioned spring break is coming. Yeah, so we've got spring break is probably our next big travel holiday coming up. My condolences, Barbara, on your friend who passed. Speaking of this risk of passing and underlying conditions, one of the things that contributes to the mortality rate of COVID. Now, I want to be clear. We have learned a lot about what makes this disease work and not work. We don't, we've got a vaccine now. I'll talk about that effort later, but we've got a lot of mitigation strategies if you get in the hospital that can prolong. We know a lot more about, we know when to ventilate, when to not ventilate. We've got a much better grasp on when you get in the hospital, how to do it. And the mortality curve was declining. The problem is that means you have to get into a hospital in a hospital bed. And part of the problem with these numbers that we're seeing, this surge, is that it's filled up the hospital capacity. You can kind of think of the hospital capacity like a bucket. And everyone was talking about flatten the curve back in April. And we created all this spare capacity. And it ended up being that we didn't, except in some, like the super spreader event in New York City, the sort of East New Jersey, New York area, some of these are in sort of long-term care facility for elders. In localized areas, we broke the curve and we suffered for it. But we had sufficient hospital capacity in wave 1. In wave 2, that hospital capacity is running out and has run out. So this is from Health and Human Services. This is their data. And this shows the percentage of ICU beds. Now, normally you can state this, and when you're looking at hospital data, you can state this as, well, how many hospital beds are available? How many ICU beds are available? Usually there's about 80% hospital beds are full, 70 to 80%, and probably only 50% of ICU beds are full. I just went with the ICU beds because that's how bad we are. You can see here that we are really at capacity all over the nation. And this is how wave 2 is different than previous waves. In wave 1, it hit the Northeast, the Southwest, the Northwest, and that created a perception in other parts of the country. This is a New York problem. This is a Washington problem. It's not an us problem. We can, then in wave 1.5, it shifted from those regions down into the South, South Central, and they got hammered. But in the Midwest, they're like, you know, we're small, we have less population, we're spread out. We have, you know, Montana, North Central, North Dakota, Wyoming, those areas like, we got a limited population. Well, then it bounced from the South, South Central up into those Midland, northern areas, and they just got absolutely hammered in the fall. And we found out that a pandemic does not care if your population seems to be spread out. If they all go to the same single store gas station and they go pick up their milk and their lottery tickets and their cigarettes, and that's that one gas station that's got the Quick Mart as well for that area, it doesn't matter if they're spread out all over the physical distance. It's those congregation points that end up becoming the spreading. And that's how we got hammered in the northern states. And now you can see our hospital capacity. This is yesterday's data. A lot of these states are really at a high hospital capacity, which means, think of those waves. Even if hypothetically we start declining, we start heading toward that trough, we're still at so many new cases per day. And it takes these hospital beds, if someone goes into ICU, they're not there for a day or two, they're there for 20 days, 30 days, they might be there for a while occupying that bed. Well, some states are literally at the point of running out. And you can see here, this is the actual data for the states. Over on the right side there, there we go. Over on the right side, these are the top states by hospital capacity. So on the left side here is the state, total inpatient beds, total ICU beds, percent inpatient beds used. This is that estimate I used of all hospital capacity, percent that are with COVID. But the one you want to look at here is this ICU bed utilization. As this number gets above 90, deaths increase. And you begin having, it's like going from a 1-alarm fire to a 5-alarm fire, because you no longer have the spare capacity. And these are at levels of states. This is at the state level. So California is at 90%. That's the entire state. If you go to Southern California in particularly, or specifically in Los Angeles area, that's at a much higher capacity usage. In some areas, it's at 100%. That means that even if a person may have normally survived with their conditions, but they're not able to get the proper bed, they're not able to get the staff that goes along with that, the trained staff, they may have worse complications, they have worse conditions, they may die. So even as that case rate declines, the death rate can continue to accelerate as we fill up this capacity. And it's going to take a while, even well after the case rate declines, there's a time lag to before you see that hospitalization capacity decline. And this is the danger of the pandemic. And as I've tried to say throughout, these were things that happened because of the Christmas travel. You think about, okay, late December, right? The whole December vacation, you have a variety of religious holidays throughout the month of December, but the biggest travel week is the one right around Christmas and New Year's. That was 3 weeks ago. Well, 3 weeks ago is when we start seeing the cases come into the hospital that got infected then. And it's going to be another 3 weeks before that case decline starts burning off. And it might be 3 weeks after that, the hospital capacity begins declining. So you can see this deaths per day of 3,000, 2,000, 4,000 may continue well through February, which may mean that we're not considerably far away from that 500, 600,000 death estimate for that first full year of COVID, which would make it one of the most, if not the most lethal. I think cancer and heart disease are the two leading causes of mortality by every cause in the United States. Right now, COVID is number 3. If you go from March 31st or April 1st to March 31st, a full year of COVID, it may surpass either of those two, or at least come very close. And that, I think, is what's surprising to a lot of people who are like, oh, it's just the flu. We left the flu in our rearview mirror back in like May, right? The average flu, we left it behind in May. The worst year of flu, we left it in July, you know, in terms of when we reached those numbers. And we've just been punching through accidents, car accidents, diabetes, heart, you know, we're going through all those. And now we're right below cancer and heart disease, and COVID-19 might end up becoming greater than either of those. So yeah, Jan, you're talking about other countries. We're going to get to that in a sec when we do the international. So Jan, hold that thought. Good thought. Good to see you. Lindsay reporting from San Diego right now. Hospitalization capacity is 97 to 100% ICU beds are used. So that's the problem, is as that capacity goes up, we simply don't have the spare means to take care of the people who need to be taken care of. And that is a real problem. So what I want to do right now is go over to look at the actual looking at how I know that whether we're cresting or not. So I'm going to switch over to our world and data, which is one of the live charts. And here we go. So this is the last of the domestic and Jan, then we'll get to international, because then we'll get to the global review. So this is our world and data. There's a lot of these sites like that. I like this because of some certain features, which I'll show in a second here. All right, so again, to clear the chart here, we have, this is now United States only. You can plot it against any other country if you want. These are confirmed cases on a 7-day rolling average per million people. So when you see my data later, I do per 100,000, because where I work in crime and violence, we tend to do per 100,000, not per million. This group does per million, so keep that in mind. But what it's basically giving you is a normalized rate of confirmed cases. And this is simply similar to what you already saw in the chart. But what I look at here, when we talk about how do we know a wave is cresting or not, it's not the number of cases, it's the change, it's the rate of change in the cases. So if those of you who are studying calculus in Mr. Stafford's 10th grade geography class, when you're studying calculus, pandemics are written in the language of calculus, right? So when you wonder, like, where am I going to ever use this calculus math? It is used all the time in calculating these pandemics. The kind of simulations I work for, these rates of change are the differential equation, or you can do it, with an integral if you want to as well. But it's basically, what is the rate of change on this? And as we switch to that, what we see here is, so first of all, one reason I like this chart is because rates of change are relative on the base of the number you had. So when you had a low number at January here, you had this massive spike of rate of change of 70,000%. That was a super spreader event in the New York time, from when we went from 0 effectively, or a couple hundred, to tens of thousands. So that, and when you're looking at these charts, this is the key when you look at dynamic charts. Be sure that you're not including a massive spike, because this looks flat, but it's not really flat. What it does is this one spike here has suppressed the scale so that all of the rest of this appears flat. But the reason I like this chart is you can pull the time across, and once we move past this time, and watch what happens as I pull it out, I'm going to get past the super spreader event. All of a sudden, as that data point disappears, look at the scale. The scale is now decreasing, and we're getting down from 1,000%, and we're beginning to see the variation emerge as we get to more realistic numbers. So as soon as I move past, there we go. So now I'm at April. So we're past the super spreader event, and now we have a much more realistic rate of change. But remember, rate of change is based off the denominator, right? The existing population at the time. So it still looks like it's worse here in wave 1, but we weren't having 200,000 people a day infected. So I'm going to pull it forward so we can really zoom in now in the period of time where I call wave 2, which begins in October. Let me get this here. So wave 2, you can see here, that's October. Yeah, okay, so here we go. You can see this rate of change here. So what you've got, when it's going down and it gets negative, that means that think of it like a car, right? As you're accelerating, your speed is going up. If you let off the accelerator, your speed may decline, but you're still going fast. So a negative rate of change is a reduction in speed, but it doesn't mean you're not going fast. And you can see these patterns here now where you can see the declines that we could have had, but you can see them reverse as we go into holiday periods and things like that. And again, this data is a little bit lagged, but this is why I look at this. So right now, this latest spike here, and that spike is kind of an odd number, an outlier. You got to be careful. Sometimes reporting data comes in and you see a spike. But generally, this tells me that we're actually in a potential decline period, but we've been in this back and forth where we decline and go up, we decline and go up, and it's because of those breaks. So if this continues, the rate of change continues, that car is decelerating, it's speed reducing, we still need to get it below, we're at 90 miles an hour, we still need to get it below 55. So it's still got to decelerate more. But if this continues, this is the leading indicator that we've crested the wave. You won't see the wave crest in other numbers until a time lag, but you'll see it first here, which is why I use this kind of data. So pause there for questions before we go international. Yeah, John, calculus bro there. Calculus is used in everything that makes your life function. Don't even get me started on a statistics versus calculus fight, because I will go on for hours how statistics is like blasters and stormtroopers. You can throw all the statistics you want at something, you're not going to hit anything. Calculus is like a lightsaber, very elegant, very sophisticated for the experienced much more sophisticated weaponry than statistics. But yeah, all the work I do in simulations and things like that is built off calculus. So let's get now to that international response that Jan was talking about, because Jan Soitino made a really good point about the other countries. So we're going to start with the same thing now for about well, first of all, I gotta, they who must be obeyed will get angry if I don't do this. So I'm gonna spare the store, the Info Mullet store. After all this, if you need a mask or coffee mug or any sort of emotional support, we do have the Info Mullet store. It's got masks, t-shirts, it's got all that fun swag. Bonky is the favorite, so I just show Bonky. I am the clear second fiddle, but Bonky the emotional support donkey is the favorite on all the Info Mullet paraphernalia and merchandise. So check it out if you want. You got the URL down here, tinyurl.com, Info Mullet store. You get discounts if you're a Patreon supporter, 5% for Mulleteers, 25% for Medici Mulleteers. Go ahead, check it out, get some merchandise if you want. Wear that mask. There's some great swings on the mask, like Info Mullet 1, Sweden 0, halftime, and induced herd immunity doesn't work. If you want to express something without having to open your mouth, you can get a face mask with that. But let's get over to the pandemic response. So the pandemic response charts, these are 4 countries I picked back in April that were emblematic of the 5 kinds of response. And the 5 responses were, China was the People's Army approach. And I wasn't tracking that much because very few countries were replicating what China was doing with the massive militarized approach that was able to successfully lock it down, but huge civil liberties violations, unlikely to happen in a lot of countries. The Pandemic Panopticon, that is the approach used by countries that had previous experience with SARS, tend to be in Asia, South Asia. We're talking South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam. It's very driven by large amounts of data, huge amounts of testing, large amounts of data, and they simply spread the information out to everyone of where the cases are so you can self-isolate and move around them. Data privacy issues of bringing that with the US, didn't think it was very likely. I know Science Decoded, who we partner with, thinks there is a way to do it, but not a very likely solution here, which leads to the hammer and the dance. The hammer and the dance is the model you've seen in the most successful sort of non-Asian countries, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, and I use Germany as the example. So I use South Korea as the example of Pandemic Panopticon. I use Germany as an example of hammer and dance. What that means is you hammer with a lockdown to build your testing and contact tracing capability. When your infections get low, you open back up. That's the dance, but you can go back to the hammer at any point. So you hammer and dance, and you go back and forth, and you use this back and forth. And then Sweden, I picked because they were the last holdout for induced herd immunity. Didn't work well for them. I got into a lot of fights over the summer with a lot of Swedish nationalists who did not like me because I was saying that their approach was not going to work. We'll see how that worked out for them. And then finally, Thoughts and Prayers is the US approach, which is kind of, we started out with sort of a voluntary fire break, switched to a half-hearted hammer and dance. We never really got a good hammer in place. We still don't have contact tracing. We don't really have any of the infrastructure, I'd say, to be a successful practitioner of hammer and dance. And so we're kind of in a thoughts and prayers, and I think it shows. So what I'll do now is I'll go through and demonstrate, show sort of the different responses. So the first one, these 4 countries, again, these are the 4 I've been tracking, and that's why I keep these isolated. It's not to pick on these countries particularly, it's that I picked them in the beginning and I'm staying with them. So when you're doing data analysis, you want, you know, a comparative analysis across the entire time. Some countries are doing worse than these. We'll get into those, but certainly these provide a good exemplary comparison across the different pandemic responses. So across the left, just to clear the chart on the y-axis, this is the daily new cases per capita. Right, so this is normalized. This chart is normalized by population. The population size of the country is very different, but by using per 100,000 on a 7-day, we're normalizing it and smoothing it out. We're also, it's time shifted. These are all aligned to start on the first day of their pandemic, which means it starts at different time, which is why these lines at the right end up at different times. And if you look at the colors, the hammer and the dance that I described, that's in green. Pandemic that's Germany in green. Pandemic Panopticon, South Korea, that's in brown. Induced herd immunity, switched to a voluntary fire break there in early November. That's Sweden, and Thoughts and Prayers, the United States. So you can see how Sweden and the US fared worse with both the induced herd immunity and our Thoughts and Prayers than either the hammer and the dance or the Pandemic Panopticon during this wave 1 when it finally caught up to us. Germany got hit earlier, being in Europe, but by the time it hit us, we did worse. And you can see here, this wave 1.5 was virtually only a phenomenon in the countries that didn't handle it over the summer. Germany and South Korea didn't really have, or excuse me, here's the wave 1.5 over here. They didn't really have it. This is Sweden peaks here. Even Sweden dropped a little bit over the summer, wave 1.5 here in the US. And then finally in wave 2, as we predicted, countries that didn't, everyone was going to get hammered in wave 2. The question is whether you were prepared and the relative effectiveness by which you use this response. So it's not a question of avoiding pain, it's can you do better relative to other countries in the effectiveness of your response. And this one clearly shows that across all the responses, the Pandemic Panopticon continues to be the best pandemic response, bar none. South Korea has done phenomenally well. This isn't to say they don't have cases, they don't have deaths. We'll see that they do. But compared to other countries, they're doing an order of magnitude better. And Germany, relative to the United States and Sweden, even though they had a wave 2, which you can see here spiked up more than any they've had before, it's doing an order of magnitude better than either Sweden and the US. Now, Sweden their infrastructure is so poorly built at this point, which is surprising to say. They're having a hard time keeping up with testing reporting numbers, which is why you see these jagged things. When you look at the data, days go by with Sweden without reporting any numbers, and then they kind of dump it in at one day. And so that's where this choppiness comes from. But you can see the US is a little bit clearer. This is the blip for Thanksgiving. This is where wave 2 should have begun cresting for us. Then we have Thanksgiving, it goes up. Then right around the end of December, we should have crested wave 2 there, but then we had Christmas break and all the travel, and it went up. And you can see it's declining again, just like that rate of change shows, but it's still at a very high rate. We're still at, 60 cases per day per 100,000 is about 3 times as much as the summer and about 6 times as much as the early super spreader event in New York. So we are way worse off than we were last year in spring, but we're all sort of normalized to it. So it's hard to get through how we're doing. And of course, these are the cases. So when you look at cumulative death counts, this is how we're doing on overall deaths. Again, normalized per 100,000. Sweden is a much smaller country, so this is, it's only 10 million people or so. They don't have as many deaths as the US, but you can see here how doing an induced herd immunity or doing thoughts and prayers, bad pandemic response. Neither one is doing well. Now, Germany's accelerating up, and you look at this arc. The angle is about the same, but it's shifted down, and that's the difference between the pandemic response. It's not that you avoid everything, it's that you're much less per capita impact relative to the other countries that are not doing the same thing. And again, South Korea, not that it's unaffected, you can see a little bit of a climb here, but the Pandemic Panopticon has kept the deaths at almost, not nothing, but effectively nothing, especially compared to Germany, US, and Sweden. So those are the pandemic responses. And part of that is now we can go to the other countries. So when we talk about other country performances, one of the things that came up in a question, and this was in July, and it's a media literacy that I grabbed, it's that there's this question of who fares better. Is it based off healthcare model? And you see this chart here. Here we go. This was a meme that came out in July, and it shows for-profit healthcare in the United States being much higher than socialized medicine, United Kingdom, Canada, France, Australia, Italy, and it looks like they're doing much better. Well, I kind of analyzed this at the time. So some of the problems with this is that it it sort of downplays. First of all, that chart was not created to show that demographic. It was going to show that the US was struggling to contain wave 1.5, where every other country had dropped in wave. It doesn't come from the CDC like it cites, it comes from the European Union CDC, but the claim it makes is interesting. It says countries with socialized healthcare do better in combating the pandemic than those that don't. And this gets right to the point that Jan was talking about, which is a broader look on the effectiveness of response or non-response and the healthcare model of those countries. And it really shows, I think, this analysis, which I did once in July, I'm updating now. It shows that the healthcare model your country is in doesn't matter in the pandemic as much as the pandemic response. And this has been the point I've been hammering now for months. And let's bring up that chart, and then I'll go for questions on this. So this chart shows from left to right on the top here, is sort of this scale, this continuum of wholly socialized medicine to entirely private for-profit medicine. And it's ranked 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So on 5, if a country has a 5, that's universal government funded, NIH, things like that. On a 4, that's going to be universal public insurance, where everyone has insurance, but it's publicly provided. Then number 3 is a mixed system, public-private insurance. And then you can see universal private health insurance and non-universal insurance, where not even everyone has insurance. So, you know, you think about the United States, that's a 1. But then I took these countries, right, and I rated them by the deaths per 100,000 over the course of the pandemic, the healthcare system they had, and the equivalent deaths they'd have if they were US. So I took the per capita death rate and then used that with the population of the US to said, if Belgium, which is something Jan brought up, worst performing country that's bar none. They started out with induced herd immunity and they kind of went away from it, but they've been struggling ever since. And I think that start really hurt them. They're universal public insurance. It's not socialized, but it's much more socialized than the US in terms of how healthcare is done. If the US had this level of response, we'd be close to 600,000 deaths right now. This is why when people, it's easy to overlook that because I focus on the US and Sweden, I'm using those as responses because I use them in the beginning. If you're talking worst, there are several above the US and Sweden, but we're still on the map. So as you go down this scorecard, as it were, you see Belgium, Slovenia, Italy, 138 deaths per 100,000, universal government funded healthcare, 455,000. They'd be 50,000 ahead of us. Now, the US is not doing good. This is not a chart you want to be on unless it's at the bottom, right? This is a collection of chart where these are the worst performing countries at the top. And you can see the United Kingdom, United States, France, Sweden, we're all in this range where, you know, if this was the US, it'd be 100,000 K difference, but none of these are doing well. And you can see here as we go through this, there are non-universal insurance in the US. This is a 1. We botched it, screwed it up. We've lost close to 400,000. Here's a couple universal healthcare systems. They botched it. They didn't do well. And you can go down here, and on the opposite end, the countries that are doing much better, these are the relative ones that if they were US populations, look at this, Indonesia would only be at 30,000 or 33,000 deaths. If the US was Indonesia, we'd only be at 33,000 deaths. They've got a non-universal insurance system. Australia, much like the United Kingdom, universal government funded, they'd be at 13,000 deaths. I mean, so Israel, again, it's a universal private health insurance. We're doing midway moderate. So you can see here that the healthcare model your country has is not a good predictor of how you're going to do in the pandemic. The only thing that is a good predictor of how you're going to do in the pandemic is how you treat the pandemic as a pandemic response. It's how you respond to it, how you put in place your capacity, what approach you chose. If you chose induced herd immunity as your start, you're screwed. The countries that pick that and stuck with that, even if they change later, they're still suffering. United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, all of these countries at some point or another experimented with induced herd immunity. Sweden stuck with it the longest, but if you started with it, you're still paying for it. Countries that tried to do the hammer and dance but couldn't get their act together, looking at us, United States, suffering for it. Really, the only responses that have been effective is an effective use of hammer and the dance with countries like Germany, Australia, New Zealand, or a pandemic panopticon, South Korea, Vietnam, things like that. Yeah, Silja's, let's see. Let's go through some of these things. Yeah, Sarah's saying calculus is my jam. Let's all hear it for calculus. By the way, I thought I was stupid at math until I was 33. So this whole like high school math thing, I thought I was one of those dumb ones at math. So it's never too late to learn math. But Eileen, good to see you. Miss Falconberry. Jan, Italy has been doing hammer and dance as well, but is worse than the US in per capita older population. And that's, some of these demographics do skew based off the relative age of the population, things like that. But a lot of it has to do with their effectiveness, how much healthcare infrastructure they have, whether they're able to support it, and that can be related to healthcare model, but the number one thing is the pandemic response. Thanks, yep, Jan, citing sources, always cite sources, great. You'll see that in the John Hopkins, the mortality analysis, that's where some of that data in that chart came from, Jan, is from the John Hopkins University as well as the New York Times. Silja saying, I'm surprised Switzerland isn't on your charts. From what I read, and hear from friends and family. It is very bad. I have to keep it on one page, I'm just picking out some representative ones. So Switzerland is doing poorly. It's not as bad as some of those other ones, but it would definitely be, I would say, in the top moderate realm relative worldwide. It's probably feeling that impact in a small country like Switzerland, a small country like Sweden. It's a lot more closer to you when it gets bad than something like the US where it's very spread out. But yes, Switzerland is not. Mr. Stafford saying the class booed for let's hear it for calculus. Look, okay, confession time for Mr. Stafford's 10th grade class. I flunked out of my junior high algebra. I couldn't even get in calculus in high school because my grades are so low. I got a mercy killing with a D on my senior year and somehow got out the door with a D. Went to college, flunked out. I did everything wrong, and it turns out I had a learning disability and I think, but don't ever think that you're dumb at math, because I thought I was dumb at math until I was 33, 34, and I finally realized what the problems were that I could solve with math. And once I understood rather than these abstract, just learn this chart or this formula for no reason, I actually realized the math, the problems I could solve with the math. And now I study terrorism, I study insurgencies, create simulations of ISIS and mass shootings and things like that. The math I use helps me solve those problems. So once you learn the importance of the math and all that calculation crap, that's the computers are for that. Just learn the concepts, you'll be good. Calculus also much simpler to me in concept than statistics. Go ahead, boo me. I've had Sweden booing at me all summer long. I can handle a 10th grade class booing at me. By the way, Tool is the best band ever. I don't care what you guys listen to. No, I appreciate you guys being there. So, all right, so let's. Yep. Oh, I've got another teacher about calculus class booing. Came back. Yep. Applied mathematician. Yeah, I've got now a master's of science in applied mathematics, and I'm finishing my PhD in applied mathematics. So from a person who flunked out of high school math to end up with a PhD in applied mathematics, not bad. It's never too late. So let's keep going here. What's the next thing we're looking at? All right. So pause here. Talk about vaccines a little bit. So we're switching now. We've been talking, pandemic's bad. Look, it's wave 2. We haven't had, right? All of this discussion up until this point is the difference between tactical risk and strategic risk. And the tactical risk is everything I've talked about, this pandemic response, you can talk about as the tactics, right? Building contact tracing, building capacity, for testing, building hospital capacity to take care of people, identifying mitigation measures. These are tactics. The strategic solution to the pandemic, the only solution that works, is to get a vaccine and to get up to herd immunity, not through some magic induced herd immunity nonsense, but by vaccinating enough people to reach that 60 to 80% threshold. So I've got the first charts are coming out now for vaccine. And I only want to show this briefly because we'll be bringing up this later. There's a big caveat here. This shows the comparison of some countries, and I just kind of picked them out here. Again, to clear the chart, this is the 7-day rolling average of vaccinations per 100 people. So again, we've gone from 1 million people to 100. So keep in mind this scale is much lower. And it compares vaccination rates per 100. And the thing that's misleading about this is that not all vaccinations start at the same time. The approval process, the distribution process, they didn't start at the same time. And you can see here where the United Kingdom and the US were some of the first ones out the gate at December 21. Germany and Sweden didn't even start until a week or two later, and they're escalating slowly. I wouldn't read too much into these numbers other than to say this is not fast enough. I made a forecast in my New Year's Eve, Ask Me Anything 2021. I made a forecast that we will not reach herd immunity through vaccination in 2021. And unless these numbers increase dramatically in the next few months, that forecast is going to come true. But I wouldn't use this chart to say, well, US is better than Germany because they start at different times. All of these numbers need to accelerate rapidly, and they may. So in math, there's this concept called a progress curve. As you do things more often, you get better at it. You solve your problems, you fix your bottlenecks, you accelerate through efficiency and practice. We should see an acceleration of this, but even if we increase it tenfold, it's going to take about 20 months at a tenfold rate of this to get through everyone. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we won't be able to reach that herd immunity probably in 2021, which means 2021 looks more like 2020 than it does normal. And that's the unfortunate reality of the forecast I made for the New Year's Eve to say, strap in because it's not looking great. And that brings up the strategic risk that is, and I use this diagram to show what I mean. This is an article. So I partner with Science Decoded. That's a muleteer who is actually a lab technician who works with COVID-19, works in genetics. They're doing a lot of research on the ground in the field with the actual virus, and they look at variants and vaccines. So on the Info Mullet, you'll see these vaccine-related articles that sound way smarter than I am. That's Science Decoded. We have a partnership, and we shared an article that used this as a cover picture. And it was when the new variant emerged in the United Kingdom. And this is the strategic risk. So for those who are not familiar, the left picture is D-Day landing in World War II, right? This is an image at D-Day. There's lots of machines, lots of people. You got landing craft unloading people. You've got all this stuff happening. That's the tactical risk of a COVID-19 response. If you screw up the D-Day landing, you're pushed back. You're not marching on Germany to end World War II. You're losing that opportunity. That's the risk of having a bad pandemic response. That's the tactical risk. You can still win the war, but it's going to be longer, harder, and you're going to lose more people. The strategic risk, the one on the right, that is a nuclear bomb. And the strategic risk in World War II is that before we were able to defeat Germany, they would beat us in the race for a nuclear bomb and have deployable nuclear bombs, and that would change everything. The strategic risk in COVID-19 is as all these people get sick. Each person who is sick has millions and millions of these virus particles within them, and each virus particle has a chance of mutating. And as it mutates, it may mutate in a way that renders our ability to deal with it ineffective. And these mutations may only be 1 in a billion, right? A mutation that is sufficient enough to what we classify as a variant, that is sufficient enough to change something about the virus itself. And these can appear in several ways. So the types of mutations we're worried about is it affects the accuracy of our existing tests. It affects the efficacy of therapeutics, so those mitigation measures I mentioned, those things. You've got to change the public health interventions because of the spread. It increases the virulence or spread, or the worst case is it makes our existing vaccines ineffective. And it could be any combination of these things. And what we saw beginning in the UK in late December is we began to see the identification of these strategic risk variants. Now, I want to be clear up front, no hyperbole, no scary language or anything like that. There is no variant yet that renders the existing vaccines ineffective. So that's the good news. The bad news is we are now starting to see these variants crop up more frequently. And I'll run through, I've got a CDC, again, all the links are in the document, but the CDC has identified 3 main variants. B117 is the one that cropped up in the United Kingdom, and this one is the one that has reached the US. This map you see in front of you, if it's light blue, there are 0 cases of B117 having been reported. If it is a darker blue, that is 1 or more cases. The state with the most cases is California. Texas has a few, Florida has a few now. And what this B117 does is it doesn't render the vaccine immune, but it's much more virulent. And I'll show you just how much more virulent in a second here with the Ireland example. But that means it spreads much more easily. You got to be much more on top of your measures, and it runs through the population even faster. That, going back to our wave charts, as you bring up more people into hospitalization faster, you fill up that capacity more quickly, you fail to break the curve, you have more fatalities. That's what makes this virus more lethal, not that you're more likely to die just on any chance, but it will fill up the hospitals faster and cause it. So this variant has already made it to the US. And again, there is another variant that is the South African variant called 1351. That is different than the UK variant. In South Africa, that is also more virulent. None of those cases have come to the US now. And the third variant the CDC is tracking is P1. And P1 is the first variant that may be more difficult to detect as our test. Like when we do antibody tests, where we have an existing set of markers we're looking for, P1 is the first one that's changed enough that it may render some of our testing for antibodies, not necessarily the symptomatic testing, but the antibodies testing, less effective. Again, doesn't mean it renders a vaccine. But the problem with this uncontrolled spread is the more people you have get it worldwide. Remember, the pandemic's a worldwide thing. No one cares that the US is doing this on its own. If the pandemic's anywhere, It's everywhere. And where these variants rise, they're going to spread. So as the globe begins to struggle with this wave 2 and these mass numbers, Science Decoded is predicting 2 to 5 significant variants in the next year. And these significant variants are ones that hit that list that I talked about. They are more virulent. They reduce the effectiveness of our existing testing, either on antibody or generic. They may render the vaccines immune. They may require new policy health interventions. They're predicting, Science Decoded is predicting 5 to 20 more of these variants over the next years. So that's the risk. That strategic risk is that while we're ditzing around playing with pandemic response on the tactical level, not getting our act together, it's going to be like we screwed up the D-Day landing, and while we're unscrewing that up, Germany gets to the nuclear bomb, and all of a sudden the game changes because everything we've done up to that point is now rendered to some degree mute and ineffective. So let me pause here and go back to the questions. Let's see here. Ishmael, we'll have to remember, Stormtrooper is statistics, calculus, and lightsaber. I did an entire presentation on that, Ishmael, comparing statistics to calculus, the two ways that they're used in complex system analysis and how statistics are like blasters. But I took it down because I'm not a fan of getting sued by Disney. Miss Falconberry is asking, what are good ways of combating misinformation about vaccines? I see way too many memes on social media about people making jokes about how the vaccine will turn them into some kind of monster. Bonky, the emotional support donkey here, has a barbed wire bat and a machete. So, you know, he's got his methods. But the trick with misinformation, this gets into the other work I do, which is counter-radicalization. So a little bit of a topic shift here. I'm coming at this now less from a science perspective than I am from a violence and instability, which is actually my day job. So when you're talking about counter-radicalization, the absolute best method to combat misinformation is not to be outside. When we think about a narrative framework, so Ms. Falconberry, think about a narrative framework. A person who believes that the vaccines are bad has a narrative framework of the world, and that exists as a set of views, right, wrong, or indifferent. We're not talking objective truth. Their views are the vaccine will turn me into a mutant, I'll grow a third eye, and that's bad for many reasons we know. I'll grow tentacles, you know, all these things that they, you know, whatever it is they have, that's their narrative framework. That is a perspective framework. If you are far away from that narrative framework and you come in to attack them, what the brain does is it rationalizes the defense. When the brain has a belief, it tends to rationalize that belief and defend it as a cognitive bias. So yes, you can come at it with facts, and yes, you can come at it with logic, but you can't rationally explain to someone who adopted an irrational belief and get them out. However, there are rational responses to irrational beliefs, and the rational response is understanding they're in this narrative framework. And that means using asymmetric communication tactics, which I talk about a lot in other videos and have links up, to get inside their narrative framework and turn that against them. And the number one way you can do it, it's going to be very difficult for you, Ms. Falconberry, because you're a scientist, is it's called induced hair splitting. And that means if you have one person who's an anti-vaxxer with a framework that's far away from where you are, full of misinformation, you need to find a credible voice that is within their narrative framework, someone they believe, they listen to, they understand, they take as credible, and have that person from inside the narrative framework then counter the misinformation, because you can't do it from outside the narrative framework. This is where it's really tricky. If you want to do this as a person, it's like putting on a hazmat suit, wading into their framework and living inside their framework and explaining it from within their framework. It's very difficult for an outsider to do. It takes a lot of training and a lot of effort. We spend entire defense budgets trying to do this when it comes to Salafi Takfiri terrorism and right-wing terrorism and left-wing extremism and all this stuff. It's very difficult to do from an outsider, but if you can find insiders who are close to that anti-vaxxer but not quite as much as them, you give them the message and the ability, they communicate the message, and they create a change from within. Now, induced hair splitting is the more radical someone is, the more fundamentalist they are. And induced hair splitting is you can create fragmentation within groups by showing the small variations in belief. If you introduce very small information to a fundamentalist, they're gonna break apart. So you can begin to segment those anti-vaccine groups into different segments that are disagreeing with each other, and then target the ones with a close by credible voice. And I apologize if the video is going slow right now. Yes. So let's see. That's answering from Miss Falconberry. Yeah, and Jan's pointing out the type of vaccination will not induce any form of herd immunity. It does not prevent people to pass. I'm glad Mike's saying glad the vaccine is out. Whole house had COVID. Oh, wife only had the first round of vaccine and she never tested positive. Sarah's mentioning that finding these variants is based off mapping the virus's genome, right? So those light blue might be dark blue. That's correct. That is that data on the map, Sarah. That is the CDC data of what we've been able to identify, but it's not necessarily the extent of it. So there's got to be sequencing of these genomes, and I'm hearing different things. Some people are saying we have plenty of sequencing capacity. Others are saying we have very low sequencing capacity. I'm going to kick that over to Science Decoded to answer. And yes, de-radicalizing someone who is radicalized, and in this case, I say radicalized as a belief like the moon is made out of green cheese or vaccines are bad. That sort of radical belief is very, very difficult and takes a lot of tricks and tactics. So let me see here. Hopefully this is good. So last topic here, good discussion. All right, brief switch now to the final topic to the day, a little bit of foreign affairs. We're right at the top of the hour. Continue to ask your questions if you have any. Once again, www.patreon.com/infomullet. If you like this, support it. Happy to do it. We appreciate all our muleteer support. Check us out there. It's only $5 a month. But this video will be posted in its entirety over on YouTube and then by Friday. And if you have questions about the insurrection, the insurgency, impeachment, any of those domestic issues, drop them in and I'll get to them next time. But this is a foreign affairs week, so I want to round out the top of the hour by going to Tunisia in North Africa. For those who remember, Tunisia in 2010, December 2010, let's set the stage, right? There was a seller at a market had an unlicensed stall selling just wares and goods. The economy was horrible. You had a dictator in charge in Tunisia who had been in power for his life. Very difficult economic circumstances. The police arrested this illegal seller, and in protest, he lit himself on fire. After he'd been arrested, he lit himself on fire. Didn't die at the time, but died later in hospital. And this event in sort of mid-December in Tunisia sparked what became known as the Arab Spring. And over the course of December and into early January, it was largely contained in Tunisia, and then the Tunisian dictatorship fell. The mass popular uprising in Tunisia managed to topple the dictator in Tunisia and replace it with the democratic government. At that point, the Arab Spring lit off like wildfire, and it spread to Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. I mean, it went all over the Arab, Middle Eastern, North African, Arab populations rapidly from this main event. Tunisia now is having a repeat. They've had serial protests every few years because even though they have a democratic regime right now, the economics are not much better than they were back then. And so you've seen this kind of serial protest. In 2018, they were out protesting again complaining about economic conditions. In 2020, they were doing it again. This right now, just in the last 5 days, they have taken to the street in mass numbers. The army has had to be deployed and to kind of quell these protests. I think there's something up to 600 arrests. They're chanting the same chants they did back at the start of the Arab Spring, and that's to topple the regime. Now, this is a democratically elected regime, but it's still been unable to handle the economic woes of Tunisia. And so what you're seeing now is almost 10 years to the month that the first dictatorship was toppled. You're seeing these same calls again and these same mass protests. Now, these protesters are not the same people as they were necessarily the first time. I've described this, and there are links in the notes for the show. I call it the new young street in the Arab world. You've seen this in Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. I profiled it in 2019, late 2019, going into January 2020. These new young street. This is a demographic that is 18, 19, 20, so probably 16 to 22 at that point. Young people. What's different from past ones is they have no political affiliations with the existing elite. In past, even in the Arab awakening, you would see affiliation with there'd be linkages with certain power brokers, especially in Iraq and Lebanon, where there's lots of factions, and you would have people kind of controlling the factions and trying to maneuver it. The new young street is noticeable for how divorced they are from all politics. They have lived through the first Arab Spring as children. These are the children of the Arab Spring. They watched it happen. They grew up with a certain expectations. They are completely fed up, not with one political party. So the Arab Spring tended to focus on the existing parties in power, the dictatorships that were there, Morsi in Egypt, Assad in Syria. They would focus on the existing power and want change. The new young street is disgusted with all politics, regardless of it's in power or not, and they tend to be notable for being not apolitical in that they're not out protesting. They're very political, but they are not protesting on behalf of an existing faction, party, or group. That makes them it's a wild card situation. And they're almost entirely focused on economic issues, income inequality, stagnated wages, very high unemployment. We're talking 20% plus unemployment, sometimes 25%. As I talked about those factors of instability, a youth bulge, so a large population of the demographic youth relative to other generations at a high unemployment rate with failure to meet their rising expectations. This is the classic recipe that you're seeing in effect here. So I don't know. I'm not saying that Tunisia is going to spark off another round of the Arab Spring, because it's somewhat, in some cases, already underway. It got probably the news on it got suppressed because of COVID, but in Tunisia, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Iran, you have this demographic now is violently protesting in some cases, creating extreme instability. And there may be more regime changes. Iraq may have a collapse of the country because of all the factionalism going on in there. So it's something to definitely keep an eye on. The Tunisian protests are about 5 days old now. They're very large. They're very sustained. When I do crowd analysis, these are determined protesters. So I'd keep an eye on Tunisia. And it's a weird serendipity. But as I said at the top of the hour, the Info Mullet we have been doing this Info Mullet from one version or another going back to 2002. I only started the blog and the YouTube and the Facebook really. I started the blog in 2017. I only got on Facebook and YouTube last year. I have, though, about 1,500 posts from that 2002 forward. And one of the periods I have is live coverage of the Arab Spring as it happened 10 years ago. It so happens that the first post of that coverage begins on January 25th, 2011. And that's when the protests in Egypt really took off after the Tunisian government toppled. It went over and we began to see an acceleration into Egypt. So what I've done with the volunteer help of Marie-Yves Bourdeau, I've done a tremendous job, very thankful for her help. We've recovered posts that chart the entire Arab Spring from about 2011 all the way through into it's hard to say when the Arab Spring actually ends. There's a couple different dates, but we have about 90 posts that we've recovered, and we're going to start sharing those on the Info Mullet under the historical mullets. Now, I want to be clear. These are historical mullets. These are past events. I actually label them very clearly because I don't want people to be confused as to what's being displayed. I don't want to confuse the news, but these historical Arab Spring mullets will begin being shared January 25th, 10 years after I first shared them on the predecessor to the Info Mullet. So keep an eye out on that on the Info Mullet. I'll make sure it's updated on Facebook and Twitter as well. And if you like seeing this kind of stuff, not just the current events, but also the recovery of the historical analysis, appreciate any support you can give for Patreon, www.patreon.com/infomullet. Become a mulleteer, support these kind of efforts. So I'm seeing a little choppiness of the video on my side. Hopefully the audio's come through loud and clear. If not, I will upload the entire episode on YouTube from a clean copy. So there'll be a clean copy on YouTube. And that's all I have today, coverage. No one's told me anything went on in the inauguration. So for the 20th of January, hopefully it was a very normal, very boring inauguration. That's what we need. To everyone who signed in today, especially Mr. Stafford's 10th grade class, even though you're wrong about calculus, I do appreciate what you do, your interest in geography, and I especially appreciate what you do, Mr. Stafford. So thanks, everyone. Be good, be safe, stay inside if you can. If you can't, wear a mask, and please take care of yourself. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Everyone take care. From Bonky and myself, have a good day. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the Info Mullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the Info Mullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.